The Red Dagger. Wat Tyler, John Ball, Joanna Farrour, the Peasants' Revolt, and the City of London's Weapons of Mass Destruction. London's symbol for the hub of global finance in the city, shown on the city's flag to convey heraldic grandeur, comes from a blood-soaked dagger that killed the rebel Wat Tyler, for Tyler had challenged London on behalf of the poor. The dagger survives, and it's on display in Fishmonger's Hall, in the city's secretive mini-state within a state. Its red silhouette is on the city's coat of arms like a trophy, as if Tyler's murder was something to celebrate. But the 100,000 marching on London in 1381 were serfs objecting to being kept as virtual slaves by feudal equivalents of corporate power, whereby people were caught and taxed to death just for being alive. 100,000 of those on whose exploitation the wealth of feudal society depended, from ploughmen to carpenters to cowmen to sheep shearers, trapped by a bondage that only death ended. So their spokesman Wat Tyler demanded equality. All men should be free, and of one condition. We will be free forever, our heirs and our lands. But instead of sympathy, he aroused suspicion. Wat Tyler was rocking England's power elite to the core, through his opposition to the Statute of Labourers. This law kept freeborn Englishmen tied to landlords, whom Tyler would expose as procurers and plunderers. It laid down a fixed maximum wage which employers needed to pay their workers, already reduced by poll taxes levied on every man, woman and child, in an insidious system of systematic abuse. Labourers were forbidden to withdraw their labour, or even to discuss their conditions. To combine together to ask for better wages was illegal, and if you escaped your feudal lord, you faced prison. In his poem, Piers Plowman, the poet William Langland depicted life for manual workers who were landless. They cursed the king and all the king's justices for making laws to grieve labourers. They'd no rest. On May the 30th, 1381, an insurrection was kindled in Brentwood. Essex villages had been making minimal poll tax returns, so royal poll tax commissioners, backed by soldiers, were sent to inquire into their subjects' impudent lack of concern. The unexpected result was that royal clerks and soldiers were ejected from half a dozen villages, as hundreds of poll tax defaulters bonded together to fight what they regarded as state-sanctioned pillage. England's villagers were tired of working morning till night for the benefit of the lord of the manor, unable to buy or sell, move or marry, or grind their own corn without fines and fees and permission from the master. The villagers were unimpressed by the commissioner's status. One was Sir Robert Belknap, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. Belknap was made to swear on the Bible he'd never take part in any further oppression, and then released. But the poll tax commissioners persisted in their bullying, and although children under 16 were excused, invasive searches were conducted, and any signs of pubic hair meant that the despised tax could be imposed. In the village of Fobbing, the tax collector was met by the inhabitants brandishing longbows and axes. The people of Fobbing would only pay him with arrows instead of their coins of the realm for his taxes. The rebellion quickly spread with more collectors attacked, then shifted to Kent, where Maidstone Castle was torched. With Wat Tyler elected leader, the rebels took Rochester Castle before heading for the power base of a land-owning church. Despite his gathering support from several thousand, Tyler knew that the rising was lacking John Ball. So he stormed Maidstone jail to release the mendicant priest, locked up for preaching a radical revolution for all. The church was a major economic power in England. It owned a third of the land, forests and mines, fisheries and rights of pasture, and it charged cruel rents. John Ball accused it of economic crimes. When the abbot of Burton brutally told his serfs that they owned nothing but their bellies. Ball said, "We are formed in Christ's likeness, and they treat us like beasts," berating such ecclesiastical Machiavellis. In the beginning all men were created equal, Ball said. The servitude of man to man was introduced by the unjust dealings of the wicked and contrary to God's will. Then he'd describe how natural justice was traduced. For if God had intended some to be serfs and others lords, he would have made a distinction at the beginning. Now, like a good husbandman, tilling his field and uprooting the weeds that destroy the grain, they should kill the great lords of the kingdom. He'd prescribe the same medicine for the judges and lawyers. When the great ones have been cut off, Ball glowered, all men would enjoy equal freedom. All would have the same nobility, rank, and power. Ball had no parish, but instead stood in churchyards, denouncing the dragon of exploitation. Railing against the bishops' and abbots' luxurious living, he envisioned an entirely new nation. A New England, freed of prisons and torture chambers, and the executioner's gibbet and block. A New Jerusalem, governed by Christ's beatitudes, without the poor being placed in the dock. He was to preach his message for 25 years, about how life in England might be bettered, despite his frequently being jailed, then excommunicated. To his listeners, he was the people's shepherd. Since John Ball's dream of universal equality was feared, at the first signs of the rising, he was arrested. "Soon I will be released by 20,000 armed men," he prophesied, and Ball was freed by Tyler, just as requested. Then Wat Tyler and John Ball burst into England's cathedral and told Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury, "We're here to depose you. We can talk to God directly. We don't need you as our overpaid intermediary." Ball sent messages in rhymed couplets to village after village, each urging insurrection. "John Ball greeteth you all. Understand he hath rung your bell. Come with right and might, and will and skill, and free yourselves from hell." He asked them to cut off the fetters that tied them to the soil, to free themselves from landowners who were the earth's traitors, because, if the land belonged to anyone, it should simply be the collective property of its cultivators. John Ball addressed himself to Piers Plowman and to John Truman, meaning to honest men with some strength of mind, and he invited them all to join him and to chastise Hob the robber, by which he meant the state's officials and their kind. "Stand manlike together in truth," Ball said, "and help truth, and truth shall help you." He urged audacity, since, in his words, England's government held every vice to be a virtue. And protesters were arrested, or as John Ball put it, "Truth hath been set under lock." The church too, he said, was filled with corrupt sheep, and falseness reigneth in every flock. The Black Death had reduced the population by a third, and therefore labour was at a premium. So landlords now demanded even more back-breaking work to make up for low levels of production. But when tied labourers bridled at their ruthless treatment, they could be summoned by government scriveners, imprisoned either for breaking the statute or evading the poll tax. Either way, they ended up as political prisoners. Those who refused to work for the same wage paid before the plague's depopulation of England were marked on the forehead with the letter F for falsity. It was burned deep into the flesh with a brand. On 10th of June, Joan Hamcock and Agnes Jakin spoke out against their lives which employers tried to take, only to be fettered and manacled in Canterbury Castle until Tyler and Ball were able to stage a jailbreak. On June 16 in Cambridge, a woman named Marjorie Starr denounced poll tax demands as the devil's works. She seized them, burnt them, then tossed their ashes to the wind, crying, "Away with the learning of clerks." Because, thanks to the learning of clerks, they had their lives signed, sealed, and delivered, and they'd look askance, as hard-won cash was seized by armed agents of a remote king, who'd use it for fighting his fruitless wars with France. When the rebels invaded the houses of great landowners, the first place they went for was the muniment room, filled with the deeds and documents relating to their serfdom. Papers and parchment fell victim to the rebels' new broom. The rebels gathered more followers and overran the Tower of London, freeing prisoners from dungeons and from chains. They found the king's treasurer, Sir Robert Hales, clutching his coffers, and relieved him of his ill-gotten gains. It was the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, who had imposed the first poll tax, to pay for the 100 Years' War with the poor's pennies and pounds. But the tax would also benefit Gaunt, worth £100 million in today's money, so the rebels burnt his Savoy palace to the ground. Gaunt's palace was built with the proceeds of the plunder that he'd carried out in Poitiers and Crécy. He spent £35,000 on it, then the equivalent of a third of the wages bill for the entire English army. Records from the Court of King's Bench show that this raid was led by a woman, Joanna Farrur. She was named as the chief perpetrator and leader, riding on horseback with improvised armour. John of Gaunt was away, but his stuffed jerkin was made a target, to be filled with arrows by Joanna and the rebel crowd. Then Joanna uncovered a treasure chest filled with coins, with a sovereign per person. She saw it equally shared. Barrels of gunpowder Gaunt kept there were ignited, and London's most lavish building was left in ruins. Burning for a week, Joanna's smoking rubble pointed to the transience of a rich man's power and influence. After Newgate jail was stormed and prisoners were released, the Fleet Prison's governor was pricked with a sabre, followed by the Lord Chancellor and the Inns of Court lawyers, whose privileges rested on taxes and forced labour. Bundles of documents that legitimized the serfs' shackles by couching them in legalese were seized and liberated from frightened lawyers scuttling like rats in the temple chambers. Their papers were hurled onto bonfires, then incinerated. The Chief Justice, John Cavendish, tried to escape by boat, but he was spotted by 3 women, Catherine Gayman, Margaret Wright, and Margaret Drinkenar, who dispensed their own rough justice when they caught him. The King's Bench prison was sprung, and Richard Imworth, its keeper, fled to Westminster Abbey for sanctuary. But being known as a tormentor without pity, this was ignored. He was dragged out and made to pay in the mortuary. Lambeth Palace was targeted, then the Marshalsea prison, which held yet more victims of the draconian statute. It was emptied so those within could join the peasant army in its aim to defeat all those prosecuting the destitute. From a turret in the tower, the king could see the rebel army and hear the gale-force murmurings of its multitude. The flames and plumes of smoke which punctuated every horizon gave an indication of the crowd's hostile attitude. Panicked, the Earl of Salisbury said to the royal council, "If the rebels are successful, then it will be all over with us and our heirs, and England will be a desert," meaning that only his class should live in clover. On June the 14th, the king agreed to meet Tyler at Mile End, and was persuaded to accede to the people's demands, that feudal service should be abolished, along with market monopolies, and that bishops give up their power and their lands. According to Adam of Usk, a chronicler of the time, Tyler demanded the liberation of all prisoners, believing that tax commissioners who locked people up for debt were no more than extortionate swindlers. No man should serve another man, Tyler said, but by his own free will. The rebels now described themselves as the true commons, and were forming revolutionary councils, which, through open-air debate, worked out their demands, and after shows of hands settled on a charter, to spell out for the monarchist mafia ranged against them precisely what it was they were after. John Ball explained his socio-economic theory plain enough for anyone to understand. The lords claim to be more lords than we are, rests only on their power to force us to labour that they may spend. The feudal lords had fine wines and good food, he explained, thanks to the surplus value produced by their serfs. The lords then protected their property by law and by force, so they felt like giants and made others like dwarfs. The next day the king met the rebels again at Smithfield, now scared his whole kingdom would be demolished, for Tyler demanded all Englishmen should be treated equally, and that every aristocratic title should be abolished. Smithfield in those days was a large open space lying between Holborn River and Faggleswell Brook. St. Bart's Hospital and the Charterhouse, its other boarders, held a truculent crowd with a purposeful look. Wat Tyler was wearing a thick woolen hood on his head, which he kept on, rather than showing deference. Tyler gave no sign that he was overawed by the king, nor by the crown, which was the king's preference. An eyewitness, the writer John Gower, noted that Tyler had a nickname. The crowd called him the Jackdaw. So the Jackdaw stirred up all the others with his outrageous shouting, and he drew the people's minds towards war. Tyler was supported by Ball at his side in his monk's garb, who personally warned the king that matters cannot go well in England until all things shall be in common. The king's advisers saw their system in tatters, particularly when the crowd took up John Ball's chant, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" and was being swayed by the priest's stirring rants. There are those in England who are treated as beasts, while others idle in velvet. But by whose leave? Why should they be more masters than we are of ourselves? Aren't we descended from the same parents, Adam and Eve? Much the worse shall it be for the lords of this realm, Tyler added, if this charter be refused. He described a vision of England, with self-governing communes, and with no one in the land or city being ill-used. No lord shall exercise lordship over the people, and, as we are oppressed by so vast a horde of bishops and clerks, the property of the Holy Church should be taken and divided. If there was to be no end to serfdom, then those benefiting from a callous feudal system would be attacked, and furthermore, they insisted, no man be compelled to work, except under a fairly agreed labour contract. How ill they behave to us! For what reason? Ball asked. For what reasons do they hold us in bondage? But at this moment, the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, an influential member of the king's entourage, stepped forward to advise the king, and Walworth saw no reason why any concessions should be made. Walworth was benefiting from making loans to the crown for wars, something that was laying the city of London's foundations. For William Walworth and his tax-collecting cronies would blackmail the government of the day. Do what we want, or we sit on tax money and war loans. You'll be bankrupt, and the army will mutiny. Though Parliament had complained about this gang of plutocrats, Walworth, now War Treasurer, and his friends conspired to keep food prices up, and they persuaded the king to issue edicts that gave them the monopolies and the profits they desired. But Wat Tyler's idea of fair shares was anathema to Walworth, blasphemy to this courtier, brothel-keeper, and money-grubber, who, when he saw the king shake hands with a shoeless ruffian, suddenly saw red, and leapt at Tyler with his dagger. Like a coward, Mayor Walworth attacked Tyler from behind, stabbing him in the neck with his blade. Walworth set a pattern for the city of London's robber barons, self-serving cutthroats who work in the shade. Betrayed, the participants in the great rising returned home, only for the king to renege on his every concession, then send out troops to round up 500 farm labourers, grouping them together on a mass gallows as a lesson. At Smithfield, the king had given his word to Wat Tyler. All that you have asked for, I promise readily. And now let the people return, for their requests have been granted. But they would soon learn about royal hypocrisy. Tyler and the king had first of all met 1-to-1, but then courtiers and guards gathered round, so it was hard for the crowd to see what was happening, and they couldn't see Tyler fall to the ground. For fear of the crowd's reaction, the king then deceived them. He'd concealed that Tyler's life had now ended. "Tyler has been knighted," he called. "Your demands have been granted." But in fact Walworth was having Tyler's body beheaded. The king then instructed Walworth to protect the city. "You are to punish everyone who makes riots against our peace, either according to the law or by beheading and the mutilation of limbs, as seems to you most expeditious and sensible." And all the charters for the remission of servitude that he'd earlier signed, the treacherous king announced that he'd cancelled. The king's idea of utopia was of him alone on his throne, while the rest of the population cravenly grovelled. On a tour of Essex, the king sneered at his forlorn subjects. Though as a Christian they were supposed to be his brothers. "Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably tougher.